Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Liberty Mutual for our next talk. We'll be talking about navigating Liberty Mutual's seamless journey to GitHub Enterprise Cloud. And we have two speakers here today. We have Jean Desolme and Matt Chico. Welcome to the stage. Thank you so much. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Cynthia. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean Desolme. I also go by Gene. I'm a solutions engineer here at Liberty Mutual Insurance Company. And I'm one of the lead engineers on our software delivery platform where we help teams build and deploy software using our Liberty Mutual practices. Co-presenting with me today is my teammate, Matt Chico. Thank you. I want to ask you a question. If I was to present you with a challenge of migrating 63,000 repositories, how would you feel? Would you feel scared? Would you feel excited? Or would you feel intimidated? We had that challenge. For me, I felt intimidated, but knowing the landscape we are in, this industry in tech, it's ever-changing, it's ever-evolving, and it's just constant. Working in tech the last 10 years, change is constant. The journey we plan on taking you on, Liberty Mutual, which is a 111-year-old company, we'll be taking on a journey on how we migrated 33,000 repositories, not in 5 years, not in 3 years, not even in 1 year. It took us 10 weeks. 10 weeks to migrate that many repositories, I know. Every time I say it, it is absolutely mind-boggling on how we were able to do it. And we did it by enabling a custom migration experience that allowed our teams to migrate when it was convenient for them to do so. And it was pretty successful. And throughout this journey that we're going to take you on, I got you. All right, well, gotta love technology. Throughout this journey we're gonna take you on today, we'll be talking about some of the challenges we ran into with our legacy platforms, how that informed our evaluation of the landscape and the marketplace for other source code management vendors. And then being that we are at GitHub, we made that decision to go with GitHub. How do we want that migration experience to be? We know that it's not just code that we're managing for our teams, but it's also the people and the processes aligned to that. And once we did that migration and we're now in GitHub, what are some of the capabilities that we're looking at leveraging going forward within GitHub? And with time permitting, we'll do a quick Q&A. A little bit about Liberty Mutual itself. It is a 111-year-old company, a global property and casualty insurer that is protecting everything from people's homes, their cars, and businesses. We are there when the unexpected happens. With over 50,000 employees located around the world, with about 5,000 technology employees or technology professionals that make up that 50,000. And the team that I'm on, we try to provide that single developer experience by building in our Liberty Mutual standards and practices. We provide a set of standard capabilities, and those capabilities are common and shared throughout our company. This is the vision that we have for our platform. But as we all know, being in a large enterprise, large Fortune 100 company, that is not the case. Prior to our migration, we had about 4 Bitbucket instances. Those instances were managed by different teams and individuals, each of these connecting to 13 or so different pipelines, CI/CD instances, all culminating to a total of 63,000 repositories across our enterprise located around the world. And we know that source code is our greatest asset. And because of that, it really informed all the challenges we ran into in managing these different products across our enterprise. We had issues with identity because of the disparate identity providers that we had within our company. We had 2 or 3. Each of these teams managed them independently. It inhibited collaboration and sharing across all of our code repositories. And then because these tools were managed by different teams, each of these teams had to go through an upgrade cycle. think of today, new feature capabilities released by the vendor, we have to put on our backlog and say, hey, like, when are we going to be able to upgrade our platform in order to get those features available to us? And do you all remember Log4j? I know, I experienced it, and we were on an incident trying to figure out where this dependency was littered throughout all of our applications throughout our company. What if we had the ability to find that dependency within our source code where it was initially committed? This is an issue that was illuminated for us during that period of time, along with others. I'm a developer. We're all developers here. We ever make a mistake committing our own secret passwords to source code? As Mr. Donkey or somebody said earlier, that's one of the #1 issues in terms of breaches. Secrets in source code that gets pushed into a running application, which is an issue. And ideally, we have external tools that we can leverage, but would much rather have that available internally within the product. This informed how we wanted to go out into the landscape and evaluate 7 other source code management vendors. We were looking to make sure that the vendor that we wanted to engage with and partner with in the future was globally available. We are a Fortune 100 company that's located all around the world with developers in Europe, US, and Asia Pac. And they all want the same experience and latency when they are interacting with our source code repositories that they did not have before. And the other piece is we had different identity providers. We wanted to converge on a single identity provider that was a common login experience for each of our developers, so they didn't have to go and traverse through different identity providers to go and commit and contribute back to another repository that had that reusable code that can help them with that business value. And being that we are a Fortune 100 company, the platform needed to meet our security standards. That allowed us to no longer focus, that allowed us to add our own policies on top of that platform and meet our standards. The other piece that we wanted to make sure is we made a distinctive decision on finding a SaaS vendor. We didn't really want to own and manage those platforms within our environments more. We would much rather the vendor manage that on our behalf. That allows us to focus on optimizing that product experience where we are able to put our own tools on top of it. And then this is where we perform that proof of technology after evaluating 7 source code vendors. And this is where we decided to partner with GitHub. Check out Limu, Emu, and Doug with Octocat hanging out with us on the back seat. We conducted a proof of technology the summer of 2021. And what we recognized during that period is when we when we communicated with our developers, GitHub is that #1 brand. It's used by 100 million developers around the world, around the globe. And our team was excited. I know I was excited. I used GitHub in college. And when I came to Liberty as an intern, it's like, hey, why can't we use GitHub? But it didn't support enterprises at that point in time. And during that proof of technology, we were working with our solution engineers, our account managers, trying to figure out if this would be the best partnership for us to go forward. GitHub predominantly served the open source community, and that's what they were based off of. And when we talked to them, we learned of the vision on how they wanted to progress forward going in the future. They were putting an active focus on enterprises, which is key for us because that was the catalyst that we needed to migrate into GitHub. Because the original experience when we were doing our proof of concept is I'm a developer or a user of GitHub itself, and I bring my own account. As an enterprise, we want to manage those accounts on behalf of our users. And knowing with 5,000 developers, not all of them had GitHub accounts, and it would have been a nightmare trying to connect those personal GitHub accounts to those corporate identities. And this is where we were informed of the roadmap and got into alpha that GitHub Enterprise Cloud, enterprise managed users was right around the corner. It was in alpha. So we are that vanguard in how we wanted to leverage GitHub going forward. And while they made a lot of enhancements to GitHub Enterprise Cloud and Enterprise Managed Users, it fit the need of what we were looking for in allowing us to provision GitHub handles based off of our employee identities, which is key and important for an enterprise of our scale, where we needed to create accounts for each of these developers to use the platform. And it allows us to provision and deprovision accounts on demand when an employee comes or leaves the company. And because we're able to leverage our own identity provider, we had policies in place where a developer needs to use MFA, have different, leverage MFA, or use a company device to even access any of our source code repositories. And we're able to leverage those controls at our identity provider layer and not rely on GitHub itself. And lastly, audit logging. Because GitHub was taking that enterprise persona seriously, they built native logging, audit logging directly into the product. And we didn't have to think about configuring a custom audit logging solution to pull out the logs from the platform and put it into our own log aggregation tool. It was a native connection that was easy, and we didn't have to think about it. That's a key critical component for enterprises at our scale. And while we are setting this foundation to migrate into GitHub Enterprise Cloud, it's not just migrating into the product, it's also managing and making changes to your own company and your environment. It requires a re-architecture of how you integrate with GitHub into your internal CI/CD systems. For us, we know that GitHub is an external SaaS application. We still want to provide the capability for developers to perform a commit in GitHub to allow them to push a build into one of our 13 CI/CD systems. And because of the change in our identity providers, it required new authentication patterns for how our developers interacted directly with their repositories, and how did they have the ability to create new repositories through our own developer portal. And lastly, we are a complex enterprise. Identity and team management was a challenge in terms of how we wanted to move forward with that. There's challenges with how, even though they made the process to create a GitHub handle easy, there's a number of steps and challenges you need to take into account when you're using enterprise managed users when you are creating those GitHub handles from your own identity provider, along with team management. That's a new paradigm shift that was not in our previous legacy products that we had to take into account and learn and how we wanted to implement it into our new identity provider as it related to GitHub itself. And while we were performing all of this foundation work for a period of about 6 months or so, we were continuously communicating with our stakeholders and business partners and business sponsors. We set a date of June 27, 2022, a drop dead date in terms of letting our developer community know a year ahead in time that this is the date where we plan to shut off all of our Bitbucket instances, and this is the date that you need to migrate all your source code. This was key for us because it set a deadline for all of our teams, and they were aware, and it was being communicated to them on a regular basis through various documentation portals that we had available, blog posts, various roadshows, on a bi-weekly cadence, informing our development community that these changes were coming, which was key, and it allowed them to provide feedback. We also had various dashboards that informed the teams of the status of their repositories as it related to the migration onto GitHub, where it told them this is the date that push occurred on your repository, and whether it was running any applications in our cloud runtimes. So it gave teams an indicator that these repositories were very important, or whether they weren't. So it allowed a lot of cleanup. Like I mentioned, 63,000, but we only migrated 33,000 going forward. And lastly, we worked with our GitHub professional services to provide training, which was over a period of 3 to 6 months, where we expected our lead engineers to come in for 2 days for 4 hours a session to learn about GitHub, what are the processes that we're implementing on top of it, and they were expected to bring that back and share with their teams, which was really helpful. And then we had various community chat channels. So we had open forums that allowed teams to communicate when they had any questions and learn about what was coming. Now, while we were setting up this foundation, communicating with our stakeholders and developers on a regular basis, we were also building this migration experience. This migration experience was key for our success, and we enabled it for our developers. And I'll be passing it off to my teammate, Matt Chico.
Awesome.
Nice job.
Thanks, Shane. Let's see if this thing works. It doesn't. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Chico. I'm a principal software engineer, Liberty Mutual, and I wrote a bunch of the migration code for our migration application that migrated all of our source code from our legacy platform to GitHub Enterprise Cloud. So when we first sat down to tackle the migration, we had a few goals in mind. Obviously, the first, we need to move everything, right? From our source code, most obvious, PR history, user attribution of the pull requests, as well as commits, and all the permissions on the repositories, but not only the repositories, but as a platform as a whole. We also needed to migrate all of the integration points, including CI/CD tools, work item management, and custom homegrown applications that we have a plethora of all across the board that one way interact with Git repositories. And we wanted to do all of this as seamlessly as possible with a one-click migration for our developers so they could stay focused on their business critical applications and not have to worry about a migration. And so that's why we went ahead and asked our users, what do you want to see in this migration tool? When we went through these user interviews, we really framed it with two questions in mind. Would you like to see a big bang migration? I'm sure we've all done those, right? Where you basically just take a day on a weekend and you migrate everything at once. Or do we want a self-service migration tool where people can actually go click the repositories they want to migrate and do it when they want to? And so, as you can see here from some of these bubbles, I think the user stories really told themselves. People want to migrate within their time zone. We have people all the way from the US to APAC, and there's no time you could pick that wasn't going to impact our users. They wanted support for unique and complex use cases. If you did a migration at this scale of 33,000 repositories, how are you going to support all those users at once when they wake up on Monday morning and all their stuff's broken, right? And finally, the one that's most important is people want to migrate business critical repositories when it was most convenient to them. I'm sure we all have release weekends. We have teams that do things on their own schedule. There's no weekend you can pick in the world that will support all of those complex use cases at the business scale that we do. And so that's why we made a self-service migration application that allowed people to migrate on their own time in a one-click experience. So let's jump in to a bit of a demo here. This is the landing page. You have two options. You can migrate a single repository, or you can migrate multiple by a Bitbucket project. I want to highlight on the migration process. Thank you. So first step is you'd select your repositories, right? And like I said, you could do that one of two ways. You could enter the Bitbucket URL manually, or you could go and do it by project, which we'll touch on in the actual demo. You'd then be greeted by a pre-migration health check. This was extremely important because there were certain issues we were aware of that we got in front of users, and there was 3 different statuses. You would have passed, obviously self-explanatory there. You would have warning. That was something we couldn't automatically fix, and so it was something that we would make users aware of and get in front of them before the migration process started. And then finally, the last was failed, and it was something that we were able to automate, but required user intervention. Once you actually went through the health check, you would start the migration. You would then have real live status updates for each of your migrations with status codes for each individual phase of the migration process. You would then be notified of whether it was succeeded or failed. And then after that, you would have manual steps and checks at the end that you would go through, leading the user to the end of the migration process for those repositories. So, got a quick GIF here for you. This is the first experience, and as you can see, you'd enter the repository URL, you'd click Add. This is the health check, and this one particularly is passed. So you can see from naming conflicts all the way from pipeline, things that we couldn't automate. You'd then be able to click the migrate button if it was in a passed or warning state, review and confirm, and then we had another landing page where it showed you the status of all the ones you selected. You would then confirm, and then this was a custom screen that basically said there's no going back. And what was really cool about this migration is we actually failed forward. We never failed backward. Not one repository did we revert a migration of, which was great. What I want to really touch on is the pre-migration health check. And this was critical to our success rate across the board for these repositories because we were able to actually make users aware of issues before and not allow them to migrate until they were up to our standards. So the two I really want to touch on here, you can take a look at the whole list, but two I really want to touch on is naming conflicts. And regardless of what platform you're coming from, we came from Bitbucket Server, but if you're coming from GitHub Server or anything else where you have multiple organizations or multiple options where you can have the same repository name, we had to create an experience since we were going to a flat org structure with just one organization in GitHub where you can't have the same name twice. And we had a plethora of names that were taken. Test, I think we had like 15 of them across all our projects. And so we had an experience where in the tool, you would be able to enter the new repository name if there was a conflict detected, and it would dynamically update all your CI/CD pipelines for you, all the custom homegrown applications that interfaced with it, and it would do all that for you, and then it would allow you to migrate afterwards. The other I want to touch on is code owners. Regardless of the platform you're coming from, whether it's GitLab or Bitbucket or any others, they all have a concept of code owners, and they're all a little bit different. And Gene touched on it before, but we have a different RBAC model in the new system for GitHub Enterprise Cloud, and so the team structure and the identity was different. So we weren't actually able to automate any of the code owner structure, but we gave good documentation, put issues on their repositories, and allowed for copy and paste examples for whatever they would need. And so this health check was critical because all of these issues were faced for the user before they migrated, and it really allowed them to migrate with ease, and our success rate was so high because of it. So the second and more popular option was batch migrating by project. So as you can see here, enter the project key with Bitbucket. You're greeted by 4 different tabs where we filtered out based on the migration status of unmigrated, currently migrated, failed migrations, and successes. So as you can see here, it runs all the individual health checks as you view them on the page. So if you scroll, it would auto-load them asynchronously on view. And what I really want to touch on here is the do not migrate functionality, which, as you can see on the left, or on your right, was really important. Gene touched on it, but we actually had 63,000 active repositories, and we only migrated 33,000 of them. At Liberty, we have one production, quote-unquote production instance. We don't have any sandbox environment, and because of that, if people want to make any testing repositories, hackathon repositories, all of it's bundled up into our production environment. And so we had a ton of archived, unused repositories out there. And because of that, we used this as an opportunity to clean up that tech debt. And so creating this do not migrate feature allowed us to get rid of around 30,000 repositories. So not only did we migrate 33,000, we were able to clean up 30,000 in tech debt using and creating this feature. The last piece of functionality I want to touch on was viewing your migrations. So when you actually clicked on the migrate button after you selected all the repositories that you wanted to migrate, it would bring you to this page. And this was great because it would allow you to see all the repositories that you actually kicked off and whether they were success, failed, or currently in progress, and it would update in real time the status of those individual repositories. What I want to touch on here is the next steps. And this gives you the remote repository to copy paste, the clone URL, tons of internal documentation on the differences between Bitbucket and GitHub Enterprise Cloud, what you need to know, and then updating your local machine with using the GitHub CLI and the new ways to authenticate. So the idea behind this is the last step in the journey, and we wanted to make sure that every single user that interfaced with GitHub from the get-go understood what they needed to do to get started. So now that you've seen it in action, how does this thing actually work? So very simplified architecture diagram here, but the front end was written in React, and the back end was written all serverless on AWS. We chose to write it in Python using the async.io library. The reason being, we could get it out the door as fast as humanly possible and weren't bogged down by our programming language of choice. Once the repository was successfully ran the health check and it was migrated, it would actually get sent to an SQS queue and then processed through that queue to ECS Fargate, where we had a container for each individual repository that would migrate each repository in the queue. What I really want to touch on is the queue, the importance of the queue for this entire process. The queue served more than just funneling and processing requests. It actually served as a gate for allowing only 30 repositories to be ran in the ECS Fargate tasks at a time. The reason we chose 30 repositories, we found it as a sweet spot to not DDoS our own Bitbucket instances, not hit any GitHub rate limit requests, as well as all of our CI/CD platforms and our internal services that communicated with Git in this process. Once it actually made it through that queue and it was being processed in the Fargate container, those were dynamically sizing based on the repository size. So we had a big challenge where we had huge repository sizes for a small amount of our repositories, and this architectural decision allowed for us to scale that infrastructure based on the repository size at hand. So if we had a 4 gig repository, we would scale that container accordingly, and if we had a 200 meg repository, we would scale that down, obviously. And what this really allowed for is it allowed us to save, 1, a ton of money, and 2, to have the most efficient container for the job. Once it got through that container and it was actually migrated from a source code perspective, PR history, et cetera, it would fire a status update to our Dynamo table, and we had a state machine listening off that Dynamo table for the post-processing. And that box doesn't really do it justice of how much stuff happens on the post-processing, but just to touch on a few, it would update all the permissions from our old model to the new model. It would update all of the branch protections and repo settings to match what we expected at Liberty Mutual. And then, last but not least, it would migrate all of the different integration points that we touched on the first goals of the CI/CD pipelines and any of the custom homegrown applications. And it did all that for users without them having to do anything, all automated, one click of a button. Absolutely fantastic. And so, the architecture is great, but what it really allowed for is it allowed for us to have a really good support model. Over the 10-week period of this migration and making it self-service, we didn't actually have to onboard any other additional support for this migration effort. As an engineering team, we were able to take all support tickets and work on them internally without any additional support. We were able to help business-critical repositories and support those basically whenever they requested. So we would have teams reach out to us and ask us for support on those repositories. Say 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, they'd reach out, and we'd be standing by if any of their repositories failed, because if they did, it would have business impact. Not only did we help those business-critical repositories, but we had really good observability for those who didn't reach out. So if their repository actually failed the migration, we would see and have alerts sent to our Slack channels immediately, and we would fix those within minutes. So users didn't even have to fill out a support ticket to get their migration fixed. We were fixing it before they even really knew it happened. Yep. So talking about and looking at the actual architecture and looking at the tool, let's talk about what the numbers that we accomplished. So within a 10-week period, from spring to summer of 2022, we were able to migrate 33,000 repositories. And I think also another impressive number, right, is we had 63,000, so we were able to cut down on tech debt of 30,000 repositories, which were bogging down our system. We had a peak migration of 3,000 repositories per day without taking down any of our platforms, and we had over a 97% success rate. So users literally went in, clicked one button, and it migrated all their stuff, and they didn't have to take any other action unless they needed to update their co-owners or any of those little things that we really couldn't automate. And now, these numbers look great, and we can sit here and boast all day about how awesome we think our own tool is, but what did our users really think? How did it impact the business? So we have a quote here from one of our solutions engineers, which says, "We had planned for a fairly large amount of work for our teams to migrate hundreds of repos, and the overwhelming majority of them have been migrated painlessly in a single sprint." That's a testimony to the work you all have done. So I think this just goes to show, if you put your users first, you do user interviews, and you build the product for what the company actually needs, you can save your company a ton of time, money, and effort by building the right solution and not just trying to get it to the finish line. Now, just migrating our source code was the first step in our journey. We're already leveraging GitHub Advanced Security across the board, and we're using push protections and secret scanning. And here's a quote from one of our security architects, which says, "We are reducing the risk within our repositories by leveraging push protections to stop secrets from being committed into them. However, if they are committed, we can take corrective action based on the alerts generated from secret scanning." So Gene alluded to it at the beginning. We want that unified developer experience. And migrating our source code allowed us to now take advantage of some of those original challenges that we had in place. And we're now able to leverage these features from GitHub Advanced Security to combat them.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
I know that was a lot. That was amazing. I'm still excited and proud how we were able to accomplish this. One of the things that you saw is we were able to take 4 Bitbucket instances and consolidate into one. We have a large platform that I showed earlier, and it's only the first of the tools and capabilities that we provide as a company where we want to consolidate and make it into that one global software delivery. And as our product owner said, this is the first step in our journey of becoming one global software delivery. And it really holds true because we want to take more advantage of the capabilities within GitHub, from GitHub Actions, that would allow us to consolidate our 13 CI/CD pipelines into one. What would that look like to bring that cohesive experience for our developers so they don't have to go to different tools to either build and deploy their code, whereas it could be in the same experience. The other and that's GitHub Action is something we're looking at and experimenting with today to see how it would fit within our operational model. And the other product and capability we're looking within for GitHub is GitHub Copilot. As we saw during our keynote today, AI is all the rage. GitHub itself is being refounded on Copilot, and it's just part of our journey of what we're looking to provide for our developers and bringing back developer efficiency so they have a faster time to market and probably better job satisfaction when they are delivering business critical features for our customers. Throughout this journey, you learn how we migrated to GitHub, the journey we went going from 63,000 repositories down into 33,000, migrating it into GitHub. We are so proud of the work that we were able to do. And it's not the end for us. We're looking at migrating other pieces of our platform, and this pattern and the successes that we've learned from it is something that we're going to continue doing because we know the gains that it provides to our developer community, and we'll continue doing that. We have about 6 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
Hi. Two-part question. Is it open source and is it based on the there you are. And is it based on the Bitbucket Explorer, right, from Microsoft, from GitHub that they have for the Bitbucket migration?
So it is not. And that was the first question we were expecting. But even though it's not open source, there was a data migration processing in the diagram, and we used a tool prior to that GitHub Enterprise Importer tool. It's now available to you. So you could take that tool, which has the Bitbucket exporter, and then migrate your code into GitHub itself. But all of the processing that we did around that tool is exclusive to Liberty Mutual. So
you mentioned single org and flat hierarchy. How did you do the conventions and to migrate like 30,000 repos without the naming conflicts? What conventions did you put in place?
we didn't put any conventions in place. Basically, how that worked is we stored all of the GitHub. So from migration 1 of the repository from Bitbucket, we stored those names in a Dynamo table, and then every time a migration happened or someone wanted to go migrate something, we checked to see if that name already was stored in GitHub. And so we didn't have any naming conventions per se. It was just first come, first serve across the board.
How do you handle the searching, like getting the repos to the engineers? How do they search?
So that's been a problem because it's flat. Right now, we're starting to leverage repository properties, I believe is what it is, which is, I think, an alpha or beta, and that allows you to actually tag repositories and look up by those tags. And so that's really helpful because we have internal systems that aggregate these repositories into subsets, and so people can search by those commonalities.
The other piece is that we also use topics to categorize all the migrated repositories, and they had that Bitbucket project as a topic. But there were some limitations there because of the character limit. So, right here.
Yeah, okay, just wanted to double check that. So when you talked about the ecosystem, the tooling ecosystem, you mentioned the 13 different CI instances lying around. I'm sure it doesn't just end there. As you're doing these migrations and you're planning your consolidation of your platform, how does that look from like an ownership perspective, right? So, you know, I'm sure you have multiple teams owning these things. Are you looking to consolidate the delivery into one platform team, or are you still working on, you know, how you're going to split ownership up across that?
So we're looking at having that single developer experience. We actually have that as a corporate goal in terms of reusability, and I think that's the key driver for it because it started at the top. Like in the past, we have had organizations that were spread out, and now they want to bring common tooling together, and that was a corporate goal, and that helps drive the reusability within a single team. So our team manages, we were able to take those products from those other teams into our own portfolio, and we're managing going forward. I think we have about 2 minutes for one more question. So.
Real quick question, kind of following on his. After you do all the machinery to migrate everything, you've got all these businesses that have to make sure this thing's still up and running. So that's that scale that you're doing that sort of acceptance testing of everything that's been migrated. That just kind of boggles my mind. Like, could you talk a little bit more about how you did that as you took all these instances over? Because there's a difference between what we do and, you know, the business owners that have to make sure that that's up and running. And maybe just talk about how you work through that with them.
Are you talking about specifically the application runtime itself, or like the pipelines, the integration points?
The application itself, to make sure that in prod everything is working as it should.
Yeah, yeah.
Even though you've sussed all that out through machinery, but there's still the...
Yeah, so, all right, let me re-ask the question because they'll, perfect, yeah. So I think the question is, how do we make sure that we weren't going to break any production deploys or any situation where people wouldn't be able to build or deploy their code out to production? I think extensive testing across, and we, from a pipeline perspective, we have a ton of instances, but a lot of it's very similar. So we were able to essentially have alpha and beta offerings for what we were doing and make sure that it worked across the board. And then once we were extremely confident in the solution to that problem, we rolled it out wider. So I think just having real use case testing and then rolling it out wider to like a GA offering, kind of like what GitHub does for their alpha and beta. And so we were actually, from a CI/CD perspective, we were really touching those integration points and making sure that we were able to build and deploy the code the exact same way from the new repository.
And I would like to say thank you.
Yeah.
This is the end of our session. One thing I would like for you to take home is listen to your developers. I know it was a challenging and difficult process for us to do so, but it paid dividends in giving back time to our developers and our business to remain focused on business critical features. So if you have time, please take the survey, and we'll be available afterwards to take more questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.